The story begins with a guy sitting with his eyes closed and thinking that his days are numbered, as anyone would think. The young man's hands were covered in blood. Was he really going to go to hell, and would it happen so soon? He wondered only one question. Would he see the end? Because even the creatures in hell think about heaven. The guy understood that he was not able to stop all this, even for a moment. He was very much interested, gnawed at from within by the question of whether he would see the end of this world. Out of despair and anxiety, the young man lay down on a large stone, and fragments of phrases that he had probably heard in a past life swarmed in his head. Shin Hyun, as if in a dream, recalled happy moments. A trip with his family in a car. They were having a good time together. But suddenly something appeared in front of the car, and an accident happened. The young man missed his family. He had not seen them for a long time. And immediately after the incident, he woke up in this place. The event happened several years ago, and it was then that a book called The Celestial Harmony of Pure Art fell into his hands. The book had a small hint on how to return home. For this, it was necessary to see the end, so he wanted to complete this task so much. The young man saw a table in front of him, which indicated that he had completed the training. His joy knew no bounds, because he was sure that it would finally all end. He fell to his knees, called out to his parents, his little sister Yunsol, and realized that he was in a different place, and that this was not the end. The guy came out of the cave. At the foot of the mountain there was a beautiful view, but this did not make him happy. The young man realized that everyone was lying, that the beginning of his journey was just beginning, and this did not make him happy. He pounded the ground with his hands intensely, screaming hysterically, asking why this happened to him. The young man realized that he had been in this place for about 10 years, and could not understand what to do in order to see the end of the world. He didn't hear someone quietly approach him and call out. He wasn't ready to see anyone else here. The stranger said that the guy had a good outfit, although it was already torn in several places, and noted that he screamed very loudly. The wanderer did not want to do anything bad to him, but since his family was starving, he was forced to do it. The eccentric had a huge sword in his hands, and he offered the young man to become dinner for their family. The young man certainly didn't expect such a turn of events from the stranger. He was very shocked. Not far from the young man, a huge sword fell onto the grass. It was covered in blood. The guy fell on his back because the stranger threw a huge sword at him. He did not expect such a turn of events. Everything happened very quickly. Tears rolled down the young man's cheeks. He insisted that he was not guilty. He did not want to kill, but only defended himself. But a table appeared in front of him that his external level was elevated. He couldn't understand what this outer level was, and how he managed to kill a man. In a state of shock, the young man alternately laughed and cried. Tears and sweat mixed on his face. The guy burst into hysterical laughter, remembered the message, and realized what he needed to do next. He remembered the book he had recently read, and intuitively understood what he needed to do and what levels were. With their help, it was easy to return to another world. A huge number of bloody swords appeared before his eyes. He was ready to reach the maximum level. The events of our days. One young man wants to clarify who this guy is in front of him. He angrily answers that he is the head of a demonic sect. Apparently, he is not pleased with such questions. The interlocutor, with a grin, clarifies which number it is and puts a sword to his neck. The man repeats the same words. The interlocutor notes that he is an immortal emperor of the sword. He asks which cult leader he is, since he killed 6 other leaders. But he still decided to count all those he killed on his fingers. Perhaps he was mistaken in his counts. The immortal sword emperor noted that he would meet the sect leader and his team every 10 years. After a while, he no longer found it so funny. An animal horror appeared in his eyes. At some point, everyone became cheerful. A huge whirlwind whirled the men around, and a very strong wind blew. The immortal sword emperor and the sect leader clashed with pieces of clothing flying in all directions. The sect leader called the master and reported that the sword emperor was a demon-like bastard. The sword emperor was surprised by these words, and he decided to clarify whether his enemy was really a member of the demonic sect. The same one froze in a silent question and did not know what to answer the question, because he did not expect it at all. The enemy told his enemy that he did not like his fighting spirit at all. He began to laugh at these words and realized that his body was completely beyond his control. It did not happen to him. The opponents stood before each other in a blue light, with blue smoke curling around them. The men looked at each other with either contempt or a smirk. The Sword Emperor put his hand on the sect leader's forehead. He said that it was normal for someone so young to not feel their body. The Sword Emperor advised the sect leader to learn something new and come to him again, and then added that this was the only way he could make him laugh again. The sect leader looked at him with bewilderment. The immortal Sword Emperor was confident that the boy would become the best sect leader. He then left, leaving behind the sect leader and the guys who died during the battle. The Emperor threw the sword near a large stone and said that the head of the sect, this time, turned out to be a dud. The young man sat down under a tree and thought about how he could best amuse himself this time. He thought that he should create his own new sect, but it should be stronger than the one he met. The young man's eyes became very sad. He remembered the events of the past days. He sat under the rays of the moon and thought that 140 years had already passed since those events. It all started a long time ago, and the young man had already forgotten what the faces of his loved ones looked like. He was willing to see the end just to see them, so he continues to live a hellish life. The moon illuminated his face. The man calmed down a little, because he understood perfectly well that the situation could not be fixed so easily. And then a message appeared in front of him, that he had reached the maximum external and internal levels. Thus, he had unlocked the last level. The young man was very surprised by this message, because after the last level, he would be returned to Earth. He burst into hysterical laughter. The guy gave in, and even thought that one day his dream would come true. Here he began to think that perhaps they were trying to insult him in this way. The man thought about the fact that he had reached such a level that he could consider himself a god. The question seemed strange, but in order to be a divine being, one must cast aside everything worldly. The guy remembered his family, whose faces he no longer remembered, and his feelings took on new colors. There was a whole swarm of thoughts in his head. The young man thought that his loved ones had long since died, and if they were still alive, they had long forgotten him. And now he thinks about only one thing, to take revenge as quickly as possible. Anger and hatred boil in his veins. The young man promised himself that he would definitely take revenge, and he didn't care who it would be. He, the immortal Emperor of the Sword, will fulfill the oath he made to himself. In 2011, in dark and cloudy weather, an accident happened to Shinhuan and his family. It had been planned long ago by higher powers. This day was supposed to bring horror. In the other world, not everything is so smooth and wonderful. Drastic actions are needed. It's not a coincidence, because humanity should develop and not stand still. Only in this way will it be possible to easily resist all the horror that exists in the world. The hidden blessing must be spent on fighting all sorts of monsters. There are many monsters that plot against humanity. He was really looking forward to this, and it finally started, which made the man incredibly happy. The events take place in 2025 in Korea. A beautiful girl holds a bow and wants to shoot an arrow. She must save the young man from the terrible monsters, of which there are countless numbers. The monsters are huge, incredibly scary, with huge white teeth that are so eager to tear human flesh. The girl took aim, and her arrow flew right on target. She received the title of Archer Power Arrow. The monsters became enraged, as if they had gained strength, and they ran even faster after their victim. His strength is already running out. Tears are mixed on his face. He screams, thinking that this will help. The girl takes aim again, in order to at least cope with the huge number of monsters, and recognizes her friend Lee. He found out that it was Cha Eun-sol, the leader. The girl assessed the situation and said that they needed to get out of this trap as quickly as possible. Lee was amazed by her beauty and skills. At that moment, the young man's shoulder was bitten by a huge monster, but he did not expect it. The girl screamed loudly. She wanted to save as many people as possible and lost sight of the monsters. The young man fell to the ground, his strength leaving him. He could not fight the huge monster. The guy kept saying that he would survive, but there were many dead people lying on the battlefield. The monsters continued their hunt. People were calling for help. Cha Eun-sol didn't know who to help first, because there were so many scary monsters. Some of the guys fought with all their might, beating the monsters, while the days of others were already numbered. Eun-sol understood that there were a lot of monsters, and they were not going to leave the battlefield. She saw before her eyes burning with fire, open mouths with white teeth. The young girl held a bow in her hands and understood that her mana was almost gone, and if she did nothing, she would die. One of the young people realized that he could save himself and began to run further into the forest. Unsol saw the back of the fugitive, who ran away so quickly, and many monsters who were approaching her. The girl frantically called the fugitive by name, because she understood that he could save her, but the guy didn't respond. Unsol realized that she could only rely on herself, and began to run away from the monsters. She understood that compared to the monsters, she was very slow, and in her hands, she only had a bow, and it was a poor weapon. The young man became nervous. He was all in a sweat. He knew perfectly well that he had been so reckless. The young man realized that he should not have joined this group, but it was too late. The guy decided for himself that he had to escape, and he had to do it as quickly as possible. Something flashed before the young man's eyes. It was an arrow flying at the speed of light. She landed very quickly at his feet. The guy did not expect such a turn of events. The young man screamed at the top of his lungs and asked the girl why she was doing this, since he could not understand her intentions. The beauty held the hand that held the sword, and gritting her teeth, asked the guy where he was running away to. The guy said that the leader survived. He was incredibly happy about it, and she just needed to calm down. The beauty grabbed him by the scruff of the neck. The young man certainly didn't expect this. He was surprised to the depths of his soul. The girl said that she warned him not to go to the battlefield because it was very dangerous there. Tears flowed like a river from her eyes. She called her interlocutor a coward who fled in the face of danger. The girl reported that the entire team died because of a traitor who values only his own skin. Then he said that he was not obliged to sacrifice his precious life for someone. The leader answered Junhyun that he was indeed right. There was some truth in his words. The girl turned away from the would-be warrior and said that nothing more could be expected from trash like him, and that he should go back to his daddy, who would take pity on him. She thought for a bit, and said that it was unlikely that the coward's handsome dad would be able to turn a blind eye to this, and this whole situation would greatly affect the Dawn Guild. These words hurt Junhyun very much, because he believed that his life was the most important thing. The beauty turned around and walked away from the traitor. She didn't want to be near him. And then a sign appeared in front of them that the rock destroyer skill had been used, and it was used by Junhyun. An unknown force began to surround the girl. Everything that was happening around her was a complete shock to her. She flew into the unknown. She felt so bad, as if a fire was burning inside. She screamed. The bow fell out of her hands. She also lost her arrows. She was scared, hurt, and offended. She finally landed on the ground, hit her back hard, and screamed. The guy used superpowers, so the girl flew from one place to another and told her, "Let's see what happens next." Junhyun approached the girl, leaned his head against hers, and said that she was a bitch who didn't even have any relatives. He noted that she was famous and strong, but after what happened, nothing good awaited her. The guy promised that he would do everything to glorify her in a dark light in front of others, to make her look like a scoundrel. After all, it was she, the leader Cha Yunseal, who let down everyone who was in her group, and led the entire group to destruction. The guy grinned because he had made it up himself, and checked with the girl that the story turned out to be quite plausible. Yunseal was very upset and hurt. She could barely restrain herself from crying. And Junhyun continued to mock her, ridicule her, and say that she did such a great job that all the members of the group died. The young man stood at the edge of the forest, and could not understand what was happening to him, or where he was. He saw some kind of creature in front of him. It was mysterious and was looking at him. It was a guy with long hair. Junhyun froze in surprise. He couldn't utter a word. The young man saw a sign in front of him that he had reached the external and internal maximum level, and that what he had been waiting for so long had finally happened. He was incredibly happy. He didn't know whether to laugh with joy or cry, because finally he would return to where he had long dreamed of. This was his reward for reaching the maximum level. He will return to the ground, and this is not a joke. He was speechless with joy, but he remembered forever that he needed revenge. He would definitely kill the offender. The thought that he needed to take revenge kept playing over and over in his head. He had to take revenge. And then his girlfriend asked him why he was talking to himself. Everything was fine with him. Junhyun was interested in why he appeared out of thunder and shouted about some kind of murder. He became interested in the magician in front of him and how he teleported. Junhyun asked the guy to clarify where they were now, since he did not understand where they were. The young man didn't say a word, but simply walked away from the guy. She realized that he had been out of his mind for a long time. Junhyun watched the guy leave and thought about how this bastard was ignoring his. The long-haired guy looked at the girl and realized that they had had a mortal duel and the girl was dying. Junhyun was shocked by this news. He had spoken to the girl, and everything was fine with her. The guy who came down from the sky approached Yoon Sol and landed above her. And her offender gritted his teeth and couldn't understand how this happened. Junhyun thought he made a mistake, but the guy also saw what happened to Yoon Sol. He thought that he couldn't just let it go, he needed to get rid of it, and he picked up the stone. Junhyun thought that it didn't matter how many people he eliminated and turned to the guy, but he was talking about some necklace. The long-haired guy grabbed the girl's face and began to stare at her. Junhyun said that they enjoyed the death match, and it would be good if the gods brought her back. And he began to run very quickly to the clearing where Yoon Sol was lying and the stranger was sitting, leaning over the girl. Junhyun raised the stone over the boy's head and screamed furiously. He was ready to kill him. The stranger, who had appeared out of nowhere here in the dungeon, seemed not to have heard his cry. Some force whirled Junhyun around. He couldn't understand what was happening to him and gritted his teeth. He couldn't understand what was happening to her and what kind of deadly aura it was. And from the sky, an entity in black clothes with black disheveled hair began to descend towards him. The young man looked at her for a long time and could not understand what was really happening, whether it was a dream or reality. A being in a light blue glow appeared before him, looking at him with a silent question. Junhyun gritted his teeth, sweat running down his face. He thought that this couldn't be happening. The creature's eyes were like ice, and it asked the young man if he knew who appeared before him. He gritted his teeth, clenched his fists, and the stranger began asking if he knew who she was and asking him to tell her name. Jihyun didn't know what to answer, and the entity replied that the one in front of him was the immortal emperor of the sword. After a short time, he called his name in that world. It was Chashinhyun. The sword emperor immortal was furious. His eyes were blazing with an icy light. He walked towards Jihyun, and he was very scared. He told the guy that it definitely didn't help him anymore, and his eyes narrowed with hatred. The immortal sword emperor used his incredible powers, and everything around him turned bluish cold. Junhyun fell to his knees in front of the stranger, and he only said that everything that was happening here was true and not a dream. The young man in blue clothes said that his name was Chashinhyun and left Jihyun. Yunsol lay on the ground not far from the immortal sword emperor. Her eyelashes began to move. Someone pulled the girl's hair and said that her older brother, the immortal sword emperor and Chashinhyun, was Yunsol's older brother. The little girl held a teddy bear in her hands. There were tears in her eyes because she was told that she had to leave and could not stay here. If she really wants to, she can stay there, but it's getting dark and it's better to go home quickly. The brother asked Yunsol if she liked the amusement park, since that was where they often spent their free time. The older brother leaned over his sister and said that if the girl stayed in the park, her parents would be in big trouble. Yunsol clenched her fists and couldn't come up with any arguments as to why she should stay in the park. There were tears in her eyes. She said that if she went home, she would not see her brother again. Her mother told her about this, since her brother had school. Shin stroked his little sister's head and told her to calm down, because there was no reason to be upset. He asked, "Does she know that she loves her so much like a brother?" Shin continued to stroke Yunsol's head and said that he would visit her after school. The older brother asked the little girl if she wanted to go for a walk in this very park next time. The tears in the girl's eyes disappeared. She began to laugh and agreed with her brother's proposal. Everyone decided it was time to go home, and the girl asked her brother to carry her to the car in his arms. Shin said that he couldn't do that every time because Yunsol was heavy. The worst thing happened. The car with the family got into a serious traffic accident. The little girl blamed only herself for what happened, because in her opinion, it happened because of her strong stubbornness. She thought that all this was because of her desire to walk in the park longer. She blamed herself for the fact that her parents died in an accident. The girl started calling her brother, but he didn't respond either. He just disappeared somewhere. Yunsol was left completely alone. She cried, suffered, and did not know what to do, being alone in this world. Someone's hand touched the sore arm, which was wrapped in white bandages. The girl opened her eyes. Huge tears like peas flowed from her eyes, and she screamed. Shin asked if she was awake, and said that he had healed her with spiritual power. But the wound was deep, so it was not worth moving yet. The wounded beauty asked who was in front of her. The guy said that he had thoughts that the girl would immediately recognize him. The stranger touched the girl's wounded hand with his hand, and said that he was very happy to see her again. She had grown so much and became even heavier than she was. And then, with love in his eyes, the guy said that he had probably changed too, and tears were flowing from Yunsul's eyes. She didn't fully understand what was happening. There was a silent question in her eyes and tears were running down her cheeks. The young man handed the girl a chain with a round bright pendant and said that it was a gift from him. There was a small photograph in the locket, which showed all the family members. The guy said that you need to always be strong and never give up. Yunsul cried loudly. She clenched her teeth, remembered her childhood, and told her brother to leave. She thought that she was dreaming all this. The girl called her brother names, said that he suddenly disappeared and then suddenly appeared in her life, but she still held the pendant in her hands. Her brother hugged her and said that he understood her and knew very well how hard it was for her. The girl calmed down a little and began calling Seojun to her, but he did not respond. Her brother told her that the guy who was going to kill her was there, standing a little distance away from them. Yunsul stood next to her brother, who was sitting in front of her, and couldn't understand what was happening. The sister asked her brother why he killed him and realized that something was wrong in this situation. She grabbed her brother's wrist very tightly and helped him get up from the ground. And then Yunsul said that we needed to flee the crime scene as quickly as possible. A beautiful, modern, tall building, their home, appeared before the young people. The brother told his sister that the house remained the same as it had been before, and she was perplexed by these words. The girl was very upset and said that director Seo Kongjin would arrive very soon. The brother asked who should come. The girl answered that Seo Kongjin was not only the CEO of the Dawn Guild, but also Seo Junhyun's father, whom he killed. This director is a member of the local mafia and is known to everyone for his ferocity and cruelty. And Seo Junhyun is also one of the 11 hunters in Korea. Yunsul took the phone, looked at the time, and said that she had been unconscious for a short time. So the director had probably already been informed of his son's death. She cried because she knew that she was the only one who survived from the entire raid, and that she would be the one suspected. The brother looked at her tears and asked if this situation was really such a big problem. And with a smile on his face, he said that it was easier to get rid of them than to talk about anything. You just need to kill the director. He took his sister by the pike, and like in childhood, stretched them into a smile and said that he was the immortal emperor of the sword. The sister replied that it made sense, but Seo Kongjin was over level 50 and held a very high position. Yunsul got really angry and asked what that was all about and who the sword emperor was, and also noted that her brother had been gone for 14 years. The girl tore her hair and asked her brother if he understood how hard it was for her. The appearance of her brother was a huge shock for her sister, and he cannot even imagine how she feels. The brother walked up to the photograph, which was hanging on the wall in a frame, and began to stare at it. He looked at his family for a long time, paused for a moment, and asked where his parents were. They also died in a traffic accident. The silent pause dragged on, and the brother asked if his tone had been too rude, and if he had asked something unnecessary. Since his sister remained silent, he told her that he had been to a place called Murim, but the reason was too long to explain. Yunsul stood there in bewilderment for a long time, looking at her brother and not being able to understand anything. The young man asked his sister to tell him what happened while he was away. Shin Hyun asked Yunsul to tell him who hunters are and what a guild is. Then he asked if there was such a thing as levels in this world, and his sister froze in a silent question. She grabbed her head, thought for a bit, and told her brother to wait. This was all very difficult for her, and her head could explode from unknown information. And then she told her brother that she would tell him everything a little later. But now she had a very urgent matter, and needed to leave. Her brother could not understand anything. He was interested in where his sister was going. Yunsul replied that she was heading to the Dawn Guild, and took the keys to the car, and asked her brother to stay in the apartment and not do anything wrong. Shin entered the room with books, looked around and thought that he would wait for his sister, and realized that everything in the apartment was untouched. It felt like he was here yesterday. He wondered what had just happened, because he had been traveling alone for a very long time and had reached the heights. He no longer remembered what it was like to be an older brother, because it was so long ago, probably in a past life. Shin Hyun began to think about what his sister said about Seo Kongjin. He needed to find out about him. He began to get ready, because he wanted to find out as much about him as quickly as possible. And then 3 strangers appeared in front of the young man. They were in a threatening mood. They were very angry and aggressive and pulled their hands towards him, using their power. One of the men grimaced aggressively. They were sure that soon everything would be over. Each of the young men had a weapon. They definitely did not come to this house with good intentions. The young man calmly looked at the uninvited guests, who had appeared to him so unexpectedly. It occurred to Shin Hyun that these guys were probably very dangerous. One of them was the one the sister had spoken of, the director of the Dawn Guild, and he was looking for Yoon Sol. Meanwhile, the girl arrived at the second largest guild headquarters in Korea called Dawn. She thought that she had simply left home. Flowed from her eyes, and she thought about how the guild director had not yet had time to do anything. She stood near her car and thought about who to ask for help. But then someone called out to her. Lee Ji-hee, the vice leader of the Dawn Guild, called Yoon Sol and asked what she was doing here. The deputy head said that the director had gone somewhere, probably on business, and the head of the raid was also with him. Lee Ji-hee asked what happened to Yoon Sol and why she was so upset. The girl looked at the guild deputy and thought about something, remained silent, and did not answer Lee Ji-hee's questions. Yoon Sol thought that the deputy head was one of the 4 strongest hunters. She was very strong, but very difficult to understand. Maybe she should ask for help. The girl still dared to talk to the deputy head, because she really was in a hopeless situation. And in the brother and sister's apartment, the guild leader and his assistants stood and looked at Shin. The guy wasn't afraid of them at all, but he didn't know what to tell them or what to ask. He didn't think they would come to them so quickly. The young man then asked the uninvited guests who they were, and whether their parents had taught them to knock before breaking down the door. This question baffled the bandits, but they did not lose their heads and began to ask Shin what he imagined himself to be. The guild leader said that his brother should report the location of his sister Yoon Sol. Shin was surprised. He didn't think that they came specifically for him, but it was he who killed Seo Kong-jin's son. The man bit his lip until it hurt. The loss of his son had left him at a loss, and he didn't even think that some stranger had dealt with his offspring. He clenched his fists and screamed very loudly. In this way, he wanted to drown out the grief and hatred. Shin Hyun realized that the guild director wanted to get even with him for the death of his beloved son and was ready for battle. Seo Kong-jin said that Shin Hyun can start, and he doesn't mind seeing his opponent's skills. And so the unequal battle began. Anger drove the grief-stricken father. He had a huge sword in his hands. While Wu Shin Hyun had no weapons, he was ready to fight with his bare hands. The vice director of the guild said that if everything happened like this, then she wanted to see him and called Yoon Sol to follow her. Shin clashed with Dao, the guild director's assistant, who was wielding a huge sword. He understood that the opponent really had mysterious powers. It was very similar to the sword spirit or sword energy. The young man thought about it and realized that the people from the guild had powers from another source. This was the power of the hunters that his sister had spoken of. Shin Hyun remembered that Seo Kong-jin also used a strange power during the fight. The young man only thought that he needed to study her as well, because she was very interesting to him. The hunter was fierce and angry. He screamed and waved his hand, in which was a huge sword. It was a fight to the death. 3 people were fighting against one unarmed man. Shin Hyun was confident in his abilities. He was not afraid of anything and was ready to fight further. The young man looked at the 3 fierce people and thought about something. He was very calm. The guild director looked at Shin with such anger and ferocity that he was ready to kill him. The young man realized that he didn't want to watch all this, and that he needed to start acting. He said that he finally understood what the guild leader was capable of, and that he really did have amazing power. He, in turn, yelled that something was happening with his hands. They seemed to have gone numb. Some force was blocking them. Shin held back the sword, and then asked the director that there were 10 more strong people like him in Korea. Here to help the director, Seo Kong-jin's assistants decided to go through with him. They understood that their boss couldn't handle it on his own. The guards were ready to give their lives for the CEO and actively protected him during the fight. Shin Hyun angrily noted that they were just a big nuisance and shouldn't get underfoot. He looked into his opponent's eyes for a long time, making it clear that he was not afraid of him. One of the guild director's hunters used the mage skill fire step, and Shin disappeared into the fire. The man from the guild made a decision to quickly get rid of the killer of Seo Kong-jin's son, the head of the guild. Dawn watched everything that was happening, and the assistant was surprised at how he managed to do it. One person from the group was sunbathing that this was not all. He was glad that the problem was resolved so quickly. The Dawn Guild hunter waved his entourage. He was serious and warlike, but then Shin appeared out of nowhere next to him, grabbed his sword and said that they had exceeded his expectations. Shin Hyun easily broke the sword, which shattered into small pieces, and looked at the attacker. The guy who held the sword couldn't understand why it crumbled like sand. Shin looked at the offender, who covered himself with his hands, but continued to hold the broken sword. The attackers had nothing left but swear words. They didn't think that it would drag on for so long. Shin Hyun looked at them calmly. He was surprised that the guild hunters were so afraid of him. The young man remembered his sister's words that he had been gone for 14 years, but he had been there much longer. He thought about the 3 hunters and realized that their level was quite good, and their abilities were similar to innate talents that had been developed over 1,000 years. The people he had to fight with were really strong, but how did they manage to overtake Murim in 14 years? Shin Zen was of the opinion that people were pumping up their abilities to perfection. Despite the fact that the opponents were very strong, the young man realized that it was impossible for him to happen. The young man realized that the hierarchy of power in this world did not affect him at all. He thought that it was worth rebuilding. It would be better to get to the very top. Shin Haken was very pleased with this decision, because he understood that he could do a lot. The young man climbed up onto the platform and began to think about how to put his thoughts into action. At this time, a car was in a great hurry along the highway. The driver was trying to get to his final destination as quickly as possible. Yun Sol was driving, and the deputy head of the Dawn Guild was sitting next to her. Yun Sol thought that this definitely couldn't be. Why would the deputy head of a large guild see her brother? Why would she need him to be so unremarkable? The deputy head asked for a meeting with her brother in order to resolve the conflict situation. Yun Sol thought that it would probably be better to refuse such an offer. The deputy head seemed to read her thoughts and asked, "Will my sister be an enemy to my brother?" Lee Ji-hai was very curious about the disappearance of Yun Sol's brother. She asked when and for how many years he disappeared. The sister said that her brother disappeared back in 2011, which happened 14 years ago. The vice guild leader thought that if it was 14, then it meant that 140 years had passed, which meant that the guy was quite strong. Then Lee asked what kind of person her brother was, to which her sister said that he was kind, sweet, and very smart. Yun Sol said that her brother studied at the 20th University and constantly helped her with her homework. The head of the vice leader of the guild noted that it was very difficult to get into that university. Shin Hyun did well in college because he was a persistent student. Everything he takes on, he does to the end. And in Yun Sol's apartment, the fight continued. The hunters decided to put an end to it all. Shin felt that even in Murim, he had never encountered such power and decided to use the strange aura once more. He formed a fist and hit the attacker, who had approached Shin from behind with all his might. The enemy gathered all his strength. He was in shock from everything that was happening. Beads of sweat appeared on his face from the tension. Shin replied that he liked the enemy's cold and that he could only meet him in the ice palace on the North Sea. The young man put his hand to his face. He smiled and began to summon the ice dragons. They arrived very quickly. They were huge and scared the stranger very much. The hunter was frozen very quickly. Shin said that he failed the test, and the second hunter was very scared. The enemy felt very bad. He thought that he would quickly deal with Shin, but he definitely did not expect such abilities from him. The guy screamed in fear, then turned on the flashlight and shouted to the leader that he was blocked by the barrier. He was very scared and wanted the leader to help him get out of this trap. The guild leader said that the warrior should stand in the vanguard and stop the attacks of the enemies, but he cowardly ran away, showing his back. He continued to say something. When Shin Hyun appeared behind him and addressed him, he was very scared. Shin Hyun laughed, was very surprised, and then asked if they were all so cowardly. His opponent thought about the ice magic and the strange beam from Shin's fingers, and how he managed to stop all these attacks. Even though the battle was large-scale, nothing was damaged in the house. Everything remained in its place. This cannot be an accident. The opponents had a lot of questions for Shin. They were simply sure that he had prepared very carefully for the battle. Shin replied that he had not been home for a long time, and he could not destroy his home, so he put up the sword protection. The attacker was very surprised, but the young man did not want to explain anything further. He said that people who came into his house automatically found themselves in his world. The enemy realized that he had fallen into a trap called Shin a monster, and said that he would not die in this house. Out of anger and despair, he didn't know what to do. His eyes burned with hatred and anger. Seo Kongjin used the berserk skill. He screamed like a wild, wounded beast. His scream made the blood run cold. The director of the Dawn Guild held a sword in one hand. The other one clenched in a fist, rage boiling inside him. Shin Hyun was calm as never before. He said that he could be a monster, then said that the enemy's aura had increased, and asked what he wanted to do. Seo Kongjin continued to vent his anger, shouting very loudly, rolling his eyes and clenching his teeth. Shin was definitely not surprised by this. He had seen worse situations. He calmly looked at the guild director. Anger, rage, and anger sucked in everyone around him. But Shin Hyun was unwavering. The offender screamed as if he had lost his mind, and with each passing minute, he became more and more insane. After some time, the sword fell out of his hands. It was damaged. This happened not without Shin's help. Hen picked up the sword from which the tip had already flown off, and said that he didn't want to endure all this. He began to swing his sword from side to side, and drops of Seo Kongjin's blood flew in all directions. Seo Kongjin was definitely not prepared for this turn of events. He was so shocked that he couldn't utter a word. Shin Hyun threw the sword on the floor and said that everyone should know their place. This also applies to the guild director. The young man told his offender that he was nothing before the immortal Sword Emperor. Yun Sol invited the vice guild leader into her apartment. She was shocked that the door was open. The girl immediately asked her brother many questions. She was embarrassed by the bloody puddle on the floor. Her brother calmly replied that she was late. Shin calmly said that they had guests coming to their housewarming party, and thus the celebration turned into a bloody battle. Yun Sol asked her brother what happened in their apartment. He said that he liked her look, and in Murim, she would become much stronger. The vice leader of the guild smiled, and said that it was definitely fun in the apartment. Shin inquired about the stranger, and felt the harmony of pure art resonate. The young man said his name, and could not understand what kind of sound was coming from the stranger, or who she was. She calmly replied that he was not the only one of the people who was there. Hearing the pink-haired beauty's answer, Shin thought deeply about her words. A new, sunny, beautiful day had arrived. Nothing foreshadowed trouble. White clouds floated in the sky. The girl slept soundly in her bed. The rays of the sun were breaking through into her room. And suddenly she woke up in tears. Was it a terrible dream, or was it all happening in reality, she thought. Yun Sol ran out of her room into the hallway and began looking around, looking for someone. Tears were rolling down her eyes. She couldn't understand where her older brother was now. Shin Hyun smiled and noted that Yun Sol had gotten up very early and could have slept some more. The little sister looked at her brother with great surprise and questioning in her eyes, and a tear ran down her cheek. Shin Hyun asked his sister that she was scared because she thought he had disappeared again. The girl breathed a sigh of relief and said that she was so glad that her brother was with her again and that he should get some more sleep. Shin Hyun was holding a mobile phone in his hand, looking at something, and asked his sister to wait a minute. The message he received most likely did not please him at all. His pupils narrowed. Then he got a call, and he told his sister that he needed to answer the call. Shin Hyun went down from the apartment to the street, and his sister, who was in the house, was thinking that a week had already passed since the day of her brother's return, and this was so unrealistic for her. Yun Sol thought that the vice leader of the guild, although she saw her brother, did not say anything, only said that they would see each other again. After the incident, people from the guild arrived at the apartment and took away the bodies of his employees. And then on TV, they reported that Seo Junhyun had died and Seo Kongjin had resigned. Vice Guild leader Lee Ji-hee fulfilled her promises in full. Yun Sol was given extra leave because she was the only one who survived in the Red Wolf's dungeon. The Vice Guild leader called Yun Sol's brother and invited him to her place meeting. The girl was very interested in the question of what the deputy head wanted to get from her brother. She had a lot of thoughts in her head, and she thought that her brother should return unharmed. Something was bothering the girl very much. Lee Ji-hee sat at a table in a small open-air cafe and drank aromatic tea. The young girl was thinking about something carefully, but someone's voice tore her away from her thoughts. Shin Hyun came up to her, and without greeting her, immediately asked why she was following them and what was so interesting about it. Lee Ji-hee was surprised that Shin Hyun noticed her there, and then replied that the surveillance was organized for the protection of her and her sister. Shin did not take this answer into account as he realized that it was a lie and took the cup to take a sip. Lee asked if he knew about Silver Needle tea. She comes to this cafe very often because she likes tea. Then the girl, without further ado, asked him to tell her how the young man arrived in Murim. The young man noted that he did not like the meeting with that world, and he did not want to talk about this topic, and suggested that the girl start a conversation. The deputy head seemed not to hear his proposal and said that 3 people returned from Murim: Shin Hyun, herself, and Park Tae-hun, the head of the Twilight Guild. Lee Ji-hee noted that the Twilight Guild is on par with Dawn. They have a lot of strong hunters, but they don't get along with them. The girl said that they once compared their stories of being in that world when they found themselves in an unknown cave. On one side of the cave was a mysterious treasure called the Harmony of Pure Art, and on the other side there was an exit from the cave. With its help, one could get into the world, which was called Murim. Memories came over Shin Hyun, and he said that they came through the cave at the very beginning. And Lee had the same thing. Signs in the form of messages also appeared in front of her, which suggested performing this or that action. The girl noted that everything was exactly like that. Lee said that we returned to this world very quickly. After upon arrival, a new era began. She told Shin that she found nothing in that world, but this world is very closely connected with Murim. The guy thought about it, and she asked if he knew when the hunters and dungeons appeared. The young man replied that it happened 14 years ago, when the goddess made her revelations. Dungeon monsters and hunters appeared unexpectedly, and with them, classes and skills that are very reminiscent of games. Shin wondered how he and Park Tae-hun got back to Earth. They managed to reach the end, but Lee replied that they died there and immediately returned back. The young man was so surprised, and Lee asked him how he returned to this world. The guy squeezed his hand so hard that the cup he had in his hand began to crumble into small pieces. He didn't even think that he could just leave. The young man became hysterical. The fact that he could simply fall back shocked him. The guy mentally asked the goddess if she had sent him to that Murim on purpose. Why did he need all this? After all, she simply sent him to the ground for reaching the maximum level in Murim. Shin thought that the reward for such an achievement should be much greater. The deputy head of the guild was overcome with sweat from all the details of the young man's stay in Murim. Shin Hyun calmed down a little and asked Lee to tell him why she invited him and what she wanted from him. The girl thought for a bit and suggested that the young man take a little walk. The young people went for a walk, and Lee told Shin that her relationship with Park Tae-hun was tense, and now Seo Kongjin was dead. Lee told the boy that Hyun should take responsibility for his death. She also invited him to join the Dawn Guild and promised to give him a high position and provide him with wealth. Lee thought that Hyun would not refuse such an offer, and the guy said that it was difficult for him to ignore such an offer. Then he paused for a moment and said that he would still refuse such a sweet offer. The Vice Guild leader was completely shocked by Shin's words. She definitely didn't expect such an answer. The young man didn't beat around the bush and said that he lived on his own. Shin then smiled and asked Lee if she could submit to someone weaker than her. The Vice Guild leader looked Shin in the eyes and smiled, and then suggested that the young man test which of them was weaker. Shin Hyun asked his interlocutor if she knew that a year here was equal to 10 years in Murim, and that he had been there for 140 years. Leeli told him that age was not proportional to skill or strength at all. The guy couldn't help but agree, but a person who lived there for 300 years certainly wouldn't become stronger than him. The Vice Guild leader asked Shin if he was sure of his words. Without waiting for the young man's answer, she began to use her strength, apparently wanting to catch him off guard. A pink ball suddenly flew across the entire forest straight into Hyun's heart. Lee Ji-hai used the origin skill she had received in Murim. Shin thought that some of his feelings had left him, and the space had become darker, creating such a formation that in Murim required a lot of effort and time. The Vice Guild leader said that this skill was called Blood Plum Blossom, and with it, she never failed an assassination mission. Shin realized that she was a killer, and thought that fighting her would be like fighting against water with your hands tied. Lee Ji-hai said that it was very easy to get out of here. You just need to kill her. And then suddenly the young girl had 2 swords in her hands, and she used her skills. Then she offered him another solution to get out of here. That was to die himself. Shin laughed and asked the girl if she wanted to kill him, but the guy wasn't afraid. At that very moment, she began to run towards the young man and put one of the daggers under his throat. The girl looked Shin Hyun in the eyes and said that he was indeed right. The boy wasn't afraid of Lee at all, but was only thinking about the words she had said to him. He understood that the deputy head of the guild wanted to get rid of him as quickly as possible. Lee rushed towards Shin Hyun at the speed of light, waving the daggers she had in her hands. But after a moment, the girl had the feeling that her hands stopped working, as if someone had cut them off. Shin began to use his abilities, because it was not for nothing that he had been in that world for so long. And the deputy head of the guild did not expect such a strong confrontation from her opponent. She fell head over heels to the ground. Her head was spinning. The girl did not understand where she was. Without giving Lee time to come to her senses, an unknown force lifted her up and spun her almost to the sky. Shin realized that Jae-hee could change the direction of the daggers she had in her hands with one hand. The weapons had a unique shape. She replied that in Murim, she was the best assassin, whose name was the Dark King. Lee's eyes lit up with fire, and she wanted to use the skill. But she realized that Shin recognized her at first sight. He replied that he had met with a guy who claimed to be Lee's successor. Shin Hyun noticed that it was a long time ago, and he immediately killed that boy. The Vice Guild leader opened her eyes in surprise, sweat running down her face. The young man offered Lee to use her skills for Murim, but she only has 3 attempts. The guy said that he would only join the Dawn if Jae-hee harmed him. The young man gave the command to begin, and the girl gripped her weapon tighter in her hands. Lee Jae-hee gathered all her strength into a fist, and she liked this proposal. She was ready to begin. The young man thought that all feelings in the world had disappeared, as if there was nothing in it. He looked like a lost kitten and was surprised by the skills of the deputy head of the guild. The young man felt out of place. He had never felt anything like this in his life. He was pleasantly surprised because he knew nothing about such a skill and was stumped by Lee. Shin felt as if he was flying under the sky. Some force was lifting him up. The young man simply could not control his body. It no longer obeyed him. Here he realized that he shouldn't give up, but it was important to start acting as quickly as possible. Therefore, Shin Hyun began to use all his strength in order to stay alive. He was able to easily descend from a height to the ground and was completely unharmed. The guy looked at Lee and said that her skills were indeed worthy. Well, the girl wasn't going to give up either. She didn't let go of her weapon. Shin Hyun said that Lee has come quite far and she can use her second try. The vice leader of the guild gritted her teeth and beads of sweat appeared on her face from the strain. She decided to do everything in order to win. Jiha knew that Shin was very strong, but she still had minimal hope. She then told Shin that the strongest man in Murim was Shaolin Sin, who lived for 150 years. But Shin lived there almost as long, so he can be compared to Shaolin. Jiha told Shin that he really is the strongest person in this world, and the guy thought about her words. The girl's mood changed dramatically in just a second. She smiled slyly. Then Lee asked if she could become the strongest in Murim if she killed Hen. These words made the young man very amused, but he did not know whether the girl was telling the truth or not. The guy was sure that the deputy head of the guild would not be able to do this. The girl did not lose hope, and despite everything decided to fulfill her wish. The vice guild leader decided to use the assassin skill, Shadow Daggers. Lee Ji-ha, no matter what it took, decided to use all her strength to finish off Shin. The young man stood and looked at her very calmly. He was not at all afraid of her skills. Shin used a defense skill, but it greatly surprised the vice guild leader. She just stood there with swords in her hands like a stone statue, unable to move. The young girl screamed. She couldn't understand why her body stopped obeying her. The deputy head of the guild began to use her powers, but for some reason, nothing worked for her. Her hands were clenched into fists. They were like stone. Lee Ji-ha could not straighten her palm. Suddenly, she found herself at the edge of the forest near Shin Hyun, with a weapon in her hands as before. The beauty was upset. There was fear, pain, and surprise in her eyes. She knew that she had a third try. The young man asked if she would use it, and whether they should continue. Lee no, she let go of the daggers but still did not want to continue fighting. She realized that she had lost. The girl promised Shin that this would not happen again, but she wanted to clarify something with him. She wondered what he had done, because for a moment, she had thought she was fighting an invincible being that was beyond this world. Shin said that he had expected this to happen, and that if they had fought in that space, an ordinary person would have definitely been killed there. Lee Ji-ha was surprised by the young man's answer, and whispered that she had survived after all. The girl grabbed the daggers with a death grip. She was very surprised by the strength of the young man. The young man replied that her martial arts skills were very effective and decided to immediately move on to the recent conversation. He recalled the proposal of the deputy head of the guild and agreed to accept it. Such mutual cooperation would be convenient for both of them. At the same time, Shin Hyun set his conditions that he would not be a member of the guild and would remain an outsider to him. Whether he suggested some kind of alliance, the guy just didn't want anyone to boss him around or help him. The girl thought for a while, and after a while, asked the guy to promise him one thing. She asked the boy not to support any guild, especially one called Twilight. Shin didn't even think about it, so he made a promise and asked Lee not to even mention it. He then reminded her that he was the immortal Sword Emperor and would never betray his word. The young man shook hands, thus confirming the agreement. Shin said that he wanted to fight with the strongest and asked to remove the guards. Lee said she had no intention of harming his family, and the young man thanked her for her understanding. Shin tore a piece of fabric from his black t-shirt and asked Jae-hee for forgiveness. The young man gave the girl some fabric, but she couldn't understand what she needed it for. Lee finally took her in her hands, and Shin noted that he provoked the girl with 3 attempts as he wanted to learn the skill of one of the strongest people in this world. The young man understood that he had gone too far. Perhaps he should have acted differently. The beauty forgave Shin and replied that thanks to such a test, she was able to gain determination. The young man said that this matter was already closed, but he was curious why Lee Jae-hee chose the path of a killer. The girl reported that in that cave, she almost went crazy and had a desire to kill someone. Shin thought about the Vice Guild leader's answer and remembered himself in that cave. He replied that he thought the same thing in that cave and constantly had the desire to kill someone. A black car drove along the road and stopped not far from the young people. The driver looked at his watch to determine whether he was late for the appointed time or not. The deputy head sat in the back seat. The driver was shocked when he saw her. He asked if everything was okay with the girl. Lee said that she used shadow play, but it didn't help her touch Shin even with the tip of a dagger. The driver couldn't believe it, and Lee clarified that Shin had exceeded all her expectations. The deputy head said that she had spent a lot of her energy. It had simply run out. Lee noted that she spent all her strength and energy, but the enemy did not even attack her. The girl also shared with the driver that she did not know how Shin blocked her daggers. The deputy head of the guild noted that she had suffered a complete defeat in the battle, and an unequal one at that. The driver was shocked and said that Shin should not join the Twilight, and asked if Jiha had thought about sending him to the Sun Festival. Lee said that the only way to stop Park Tae-hyun is with Shin Hyun's help, and she will do everything for that. The vice leader of the guild realized that she had to be wise and be sure to follow his will. The driver thought about Jihee's words and asked if she would repair the Heavenly Warrior. Beauty Lee noted that they all together must help Shin Hyun with all their might. Shin Hyun finally returned to his beloved sister's house after so many adventures. Yoon Sol greeted him with joy, threw herself on his chest, and began to sob with joy. The brother could not understand what had happened to his younger sister. He was surprised and a little scared. Yoon Sol clung to her brother. He already thought that his sister would tear him apart. It was clear from her that she was very worried. After some time, the little sister asked her brother not to go anywhere and not to take any risks at all. The girl thought it was better to stay at home. It increasingly seemed to her that her brother would disappear, like he did then. The older brother tried to calm his sister down. He said that he knew how she felt, but he couldn't stay at home all the time. Yoon Sol looked at Shin very carefully, and after a moment, he said that he wanted to become a hunter. The sister didn't like this information. She clarified with her brother that he was already tired of life. Shin Hyun took out a mystical cube from his pocket and showed it to his younger sister, which Ji-hee had given to him. The elder brother boasted that with the help of this cube, he would be able to obtain a window of hunter status. Yoon Sol said that her brother can do whatever he wants, and she will see what happens next. Shin Hyun picked up the cube, which shone with all the colors of the rainbow. It was incredible. The stone illuminated everything around with its light, which made the young man very happy. The guy's joy was short-lived, as the club began to fall apart right before his eyes. All that was left of the beautiful, multicolored, brightly glowing cube in his hands was ruins. The joy turned to disappointment. Shin was surprised. Did Lee really fool him? Yoon Sol said that they were finished, and it was necessary to say the phrase status window. Suddenly, two windows of his status opened up in front of the young man. It was very interesting. The young man thought that this window belonged to Stasu from Murim, but he was seeing something like this for the first time, and this proved his strength. After some time, he saw the hunter's status window and began to study it in detail. Yun-sol came up from behind and also began to get acquainted with her class, older brother. She looked at the sign for a very long time, wanting to get acquainted with all the data in detail. Yun-sol realized that the path of a hunter is definitely not for her brother, so he should forget about it. The older brother, who heard about this from his sister, could not understand why this had to be done. Yun-sol told Shinhyun that hunters are divided into 6 classes. She said that hunters come in a variety of types: warrior, priest, mage, tank, archer, and assassin, but if the higher classes are included, then there can be many more, but the 6 are the most basic. Yun-sol has the archer class, top class sniper. The sister explained to her brother that the basic classes are innate, and her brother has no class, so he has no chance. Shin said that you can become a hunter without a class, but you need good skills to do so. And in order to increase the level, the hunter first of all needs experience, and it can be obtained after killing a monster. Yun-sol told her brother that the classless hunters, unlike the 6 who have classes, simply don't have skills, but they can be obtained through the skill cup. The cheapest cube with hand-to-hand combat skill costs 20 million won, and fencing costs 25 million won. Shin was shocked. Yun-sol continued that hunters with classes acquire skills automatically, while those without a class must invest money in them. The young girl looked questioningly at her brother, wondering what his decision was, and then she asked if he had money. Shin, of course, was very upset. He thought for a moment and said that he had Lee Ji-hai, who would definitely help him. The young man knew very well that the deputy head of Dawn had a lot of money, and she could help him. Yun-sol was very upset because she thought she could dissuade her brother from becoming a hunter, since he didn't have the money for it. The young man noted that this is not the most important thing a problem for him, because he can count on Dawn. Then the brother asked his sister how it happened that he didn't have a hunter class, since he was a genius. The guy believed that there would definitely be no other person like him in Murim's history, so why didn't he have the talent of a hunter? The territory of the training dungeon of the Dawn Guild has picturesque views, and there are rabbits in the clearing. But only at first glance are these animals harmless, because it is not for nothing that they are in the dungeon, which is also called the rabbit. After some time, the rabbit turns into a terrible monster with red eyes and an evil grin. Yun-sol holds a bow and arrow, aims carefully, and hits him, causing a large explosion. Then the girl asks her brother if he saw how agile she is, and Shin notes that they caught a rabbit. The girl replied that with a mood like her older brothers, hunters most often end up very badly. A red stone fell from Shinhyun's hands, and he said that this would definitely not happen to him. He picked up the stone and said that it was a monster stone, and he had heard that it could be exchanged for money. Shin told his sister that it was a resource. It produced a lot of energy when processed, and because of them, nuclear power plants disappeared. But she told him to be careful, because anything could happen in the dungeon. Shin turned away from his sister and used his magic power, causing several dead rabbits to fall to the ground. Yun-sol was shocked by her brother's behavior, and thought that he didn't listen to her at all. A status window opened in front of the young man, and this kind of prank with monsters did not bring him any experience. Yun-sol said that there was no need to worry. They had a whole dungeon at their disposal. Her brother had the opportunity to calmly master the skill. The young man couldn't figure out what level of swordsmanship he had, so he decided to ask Lee Ji-hai about it. Yun-sol said that she doesn't know what kind of contract her brother has with Lee, but she is an unusual person and will try to get the most out of her brother for herself. Hearing these words, the elder brother stepped aside and thought about something, most likely about Ji-ha. The sister was also silent for a while, and wanted to hear at least some kind of answer from her brother. But the young man remained silent, which scared the younger sister a little. Then Shinhyun walked up to Yun-sol and grabbed her wrist hard. The girl couldn't understand what was happening. He asked his sister to go to another place, as he considered it much better than this clearing. What Yun-sol saw left her in shock and surprise. Beads of sweat appeared on her face, and she clenched her teeth in horror. There were a lot of cute little rabbits frolicking in the huge clearing. My brother said there were 337 of them. The young people stood and looked at the clearing with a huge number of rabbit monsters. Yun-sol noted that there were a lot of animals, and her brother was only at the beginner level. Shin Hyun replied that there was no need to worry about anything, and began to gradually approach the monsters. The sister was not sure about this, so she screamed very loudly for him not to go far from her. The young man thought that he had never experienced such shame in his life. Shin thought that he was an immortal sword emperor who had trained for a very long time and had a D-level swordsmanship. The young man was very upset, since he didn't even have a hunter class. His sister tried to calm him down somehow, but he pulled out his sword and began to use his magical powers. Shin Hyun cut the air with his sword and screamed so loudly that everyone decided to make fun of him. The rabbits that were in the clearing were angry and aggressively disposed towards the guy, since he disturbed their peace. Just a little more, and they would have attacked him. Yun-sol called out to her brother. She was shocked by his actions. The older brother said that he was fed up with the constant arguing with his sister, especially the fact that she was against him becoming a hunter. Then he turned to the rabbits as a monster, because he was already ready to fight them in an unequal battle. Well, then a huge number of information windows appeared in front of him. He was a little shocked, but then he realized that they wanted to help him in this way. They were giving him certain hints. Shin Hyun didn't want to obey the system, so he used his sword to cut them in half. Even though he had no skill, he was very confident in his abilities. Well, the rabbit monsters didn't look at all this. They were getting closer and closer to Shin. They opened their mouths and wanted to say goodbye to the young man who had disturbed their peace. Shin Hyun held his sword very tightly and began to use magical power. He was angry at the system that dared to teach him such a great man, fencing, and tell him what to do. The young man was confident in his abilities and thought that he did not need to be taught, especially fencing. The guy realized that he had acquired these skills 14 years ago, so he fought with a huge number of rabbits with one sword. The young man was very self-confident. He thought that the skills he had previously acquired would guarantee his safety. Shin was simply confident that it didn't take 100 years to teach him something new. Information windows appeared in front of him again, but he didn't want to read them. They were boring to him. One of the tables had a warning about fencing skills, and the guy decided to read it. The information he saw left him in great shock. He certainly didn't expect this. A huge number of system messages appeared in front of Shin. He couldn't understand what they were. The young man couldn't figure out how to close the window. He wondered how to change the settings. Yun-sol was very scared and upset. She couldn't understand what her brother was doing. He tried to figure out the system messages, but he was doing a very bad job of it. The guy couldn't find information about the strength of fencing. The young man continued to read the information that the system messages provided him. There were a lot of them. Yun-sol saw that her brother had become level A+. The guy who also saw this data froze in amazement and went into shock. Then the brother told his sister if it was possible to get experience points with a passive skill, and the sister confirmed his guess. Shin looked at the system message data and realized that this was what had happened to him. The young man used these manipulations in order to make his life easier in the future. Shin folded his hand into a fist and began to run away very quickly. The rabbits no longer posed a danger to him. And then the young man used his magical powers. The guy was very happy with his achievements. He told his sister that he could now use his martial arts to gain experience. Shin also told his sister that the strongest hunters in Korea gain their skills in the same way. Yun-sol was in great shock from the information she heard. No words to respond. The girl took her bow in her hand, looked at it, and thought about the flow of air. Then she thought about something for a while and called out to her older brother. He looked at her, and the girl said that she wanted to have a very serious talk with him. The sister told her brother that she had guessed that he was very strong, but today she saw his strength with her own eyes, and it was amazing. The girl remembered what happened in the Red Wolf's dungeon, and she didn't want it to happen again. Yun-sol noted that unfortunately there was no guarantee of this. She reminded her brother that she led the team. Her subordinates died because of her weakness. The situation that happened in the dungeon does not give her peace. She does not want to make any more mistakes in life. The sister told her brother that she couldn't become as strong as him, and she wanted Shin to teach her something. The brother put his hand on his sister's shoulder and told her not to get excited. He would try to tell her everything and teach her. And then Shin Hyun noted that he had never had any students, but this time he would be the most severe. The young man thought that his sister would not always be by his side, so she needed to learn to stand up for herself, because no one knew what would happen in the future. The brother told his sister that it makes sense to teach her to be strong, and that it is necessary to move on to a new point. The young people ran along the green edge to get to their destination faster. After some time, the sister asked what her brother would do next, since he had already mastered fencing skills. She wondered if he would continue to use his warrior skills, and from above, the rabbit monsters looked down on the young people. The older brother raised his head and also saw monsters jumping from the cliff onto him. Shin Hyun thought that he could now level up using his powers. He did this promptly and at the same second in order to stop the monsters. The sister agreed with her brother's words and said that in her situation, the hunter's further path was unclear. Shin Hyun said that he can now use his martial arts. He also informed his sister that he needed to learn certain class skills. The young man thought that Lee Ji-hee, a former assassin, was able to combine martial arts and skills, thereby becoming stronger. Therefore, he too must find skills that are compatible with his martial art. Then the young man thought for a while and looked straight ahead for a long time. The sister was perplexed. She looked at her brother, who used his power and flew over the edge of the forest, where the rabbits were. The rabbit monsters that were in the clearing raised their heads and saw Shin rise up. The young man began to use his powers, using his magical abilities. Then he shouted very loudly that he could combine any skills with his strength. Then the young man thought that he had seen skills that were difficult to combine with his powers, and that was how great magic was created. And he received the Fireball Magician skill. Yoon-sol saw all this and told her brother that if he continued like this, he would definitely end badly. These words only made my brother laugh very loudly and said that this danger could easily be combined with martial arts. Shin Hyun landed at the edge of the forest, sat down on the grass, began to smile, and told his sister that he would become a magician. The girl thought about it because she told her brother that he didn't have a class. So it would be very difficult to be a mage because it was not easy to get mage skill cubes. The brother sat at the edge of the forest rejoicing, singing songs. The sister closed her eyes and thought that let everything remain as it is. System messages appeared in front of Shin Hyun, and he began to examine them in detail. The young man thought that there was a gap between the Murim and Hunter systems, since Murim only showed his own body characteristics. Shin thought that the knowledge he gained now would help him with Murim, and he liked that the Hunter status window displayed all the data. The young man realized that the systems were very different and were created by different people, but with the same abilities. He analyzed that in Murim, one had to spend a lot of time practicing and risk one's life to improve one's skills. Shin Hyun thought that the legendary hero, Heavenly Warrior, became a god above legends. It was he who wrote the book Heavenly Harmony of Pure Art. In Murim, many fought over this ancient treasure, and it was in that cave that he woke up in his time. At that time, he took everything that was happening for granted, but he lost sight of the main thing. The being that gave humanity the Hunter system was most likely a goddess, and she sent him to Murim. Shin Hyun's pupils narrowed to dots. The information he had deciphered shocked him. He felt like he was chained in strong metal chains, and he felt unwell. The young man began to suspect that the Heavenly Warrior had done all this to him. Shin Hyun is at the edge of the forest. Squirrels are frolicking near him. He is resting and thinking about something. The young man wanders through the dungeons for a month, raising his level. And this is not without the support of Lee Ji-hee. He had a strange feeling, as if he was not yet on Earth, but in Murim. Shin Hyun used his magical powers, and everything around the young man began to glow with blue flames. The young man was able to reach level 22, and said that he really wanted to freshly cook chicken. The older brother taught his sister, told her that there are 365 vessels in the human body, but the sister did not want to listen to it. Shin Hyun also learned to speak in a normal way, with the help of his sister, since he had missed out on a lot during his years in Murim. The older brother thought that Yoon-sol, due to her age, was too late to study martial arts. The girl understood that studying was difficult for her, but her brother encouraged her as best he could and always helped her. The young man asked his sister not to scream or cry if she suddenly started bleeding. This message was unexpected. For Yoon-sol, when the girl heard this, she was very upset. The brother pierced his sister's vessels and directly injected his power into her. The scream echoed throughout the entire yard. Thanks to these simple actions, Shin Hyun managed to at least somehow teach his sister. Everything went well, and one day during training, the sister almost burned her older brother's hair. Shin and Lee met again over a cup of aromatic delicious tea, and the interlocutor asked if everything was okay with her and her sister. Then Lee Ji-hai suggested that the young man get straight to the point, which was very important to her. Shin Hyun was not surprised that the vice guild leader, as usual, did not stand on ceremony. She noted her unique character. The young man asked the girl what she was planning, since she hadn't called him for a long time. Lee Ji-hai didn't expect this turn of events, and looked at the guy with narrowed eyes. After a few seconds, she asked Shin Hyun if he wanted to go on a date with her. The young man certainly didn't expect such a question. He didn't know what to answer and froze. And then he said that such invitations were new to him, so he would better refrain from them. Lee said that she should not refuse. She then reported that in Bucheon, a new dungeon with a high level of danger has opened and only high-ranking hunters are allowed into it. That's why Lee wants to go there with Shin Hyun, since he's level 20. The young man asked why she wanted to go into the dungeon with him. The girl reported that in high-level dungeons, there is control over the number of hunters. She also wants Shin Hyun to increase his strength faster, which is very easy to do in this dungeon. The young man asked the girl if she wanted him to speed up his improvement in this way. Ji-hai said that the young man uses strange words. But for him, it is normal, since he has lived for more than 100 years. Shin said that he will support the girl regardless of what kind of alliance they have. And then he asked her why she needed to make him even stronger. What would she get from it? Lee asked if he had heard of the Sun Festival, an event held annually between the Dawn and Dusk guilds. The Festival of the Sun, a grand event that helps to show off the strength of the most powerful guilds in Korea. But from the outside, it looks like the guilds are strengthening their relationships with each other. In fact, these are competitions that determine the position of power. It can be compared to a small war. Now the fight is for the right to the dungeon, so the fights take place underground. Shin Hyun asked what they were fighting for anyway. If it was just for interest, then that was very stupid. The deputy head of the guild replied that all this was happening because of Park Tae-hoon. Everything was stable before, but then he chased after power. Lee Ji-hai said that Park then began to blindly obey the heavenly warrior. Shin Hyun shouted and asked what kind of relationship Park had with the heavenly warrior. Lee said that she didn't know anything about the heavenly warrior, but only heard how Park received a message in Murim's status window. Shin thought about it. The young man couldn't understand why he was doing this, because he had previously been friends with Lee. Ji Hyun noted that Shin and Park were the only people who had experienced Murim's horror firsthand. The young man looked at the deputy head of the guild for a long time and thought about something. Lee Ji-hai asked to participate in the Sun Festival and be an ally of the Dawn Guild. The driver sat in the car and thought about how the balance of power had recently been on the side of the Twilights. This was due to the fact that they were capturing new dungeons and making frequent raids there. He looked ahead and saw the vice guild leader walking along the road with Shin. The young man sat in the back seat and began to talk about how Dawn would be finished if the secret information was revealed. Shin was tormented by his conscience because it was because of him that the director died at such an important moment, and he was the main force of the guild. The young man told Lee that he understood the situation in general terms, but could not understand the benefit of his height as a hunter. Lee said that the Festival of the Sun is broadcast to the entire world, and there will be a lot of foreign press there. The driver asked if they were planning to show martial arts to the world, as this might cause envy among hunters. He asked if Shin Hyun was ready to face the World Hunters Association, and he replied that he was ready to fight them. Lee pointed out that only hunter skills should be used at the Sun Festival. Shin couldn't object to this. Lee was glad that Shin agreed, and still wanted to tell the young man something. She opened a suitcase with 6 magic cups and skills in front of Shin. There was one highest skill of a magician and a sorcerer. Shin Hyun thought that he wanted to meet Park Tae-hoon anyway, and it was probably worth it. And then, out of nowhere, pieces of paper began to fall on the young man's head, one after another. There were very, very many of them. The young man could not understand what was happening around him. Lee said that in this world, there are legal processes, and all these sheets, official documents that confirm the alliance with Dawn, all these documents are official. Shin asked why he needed to register a guild. Ji-ha replied that the registration process for the Sun Festival was very problematic, and there might be problems with processing the documents. She asked the young man if he knew how much the cubes cost. Each of them was more expensive than any house, which is why it was necessary to sign a contract. Shin said that all the conditions should have been discussed from the very beginning, and began signing documents. There were a lot of them. The deputy head of the guild said that these were all formalities, and he could write any name for his guild. Shin Hyun stands on the ground, and he has such an unusual feeling that the guy is a little surprised. The young man thought that every day he was running between the sky and the dungeons, as if he was going to school. The vice guild leader approached him. They were in the Wyvern dungeon in Buchan. A huge number of monsters were flying above the young people. Lee said that they needed to be careful, but dragons alone are not so strong. And then the monsters became more and more. Jiha clarified that she was told that there were a lot of these dragons in the dungeon. Shin Hyun used his power and said that he sensed more than 3,000 monsters. The young man concentrated for a moment and noted that these monsters were not a problem for him. The young man's eyes lit up, and he said that the more targets, the better for him. He was ready to fight, so he concentrated and began to use all the strength he had. The monsters flew above them, and the deputy head of the guild asked how the skills had been mastered so quickly, in a few hours. Shin Hyun noted that magic power and body energy control are very similar. Lee said that she did not succeed in this. The vice leader of the guild pointed out that there was no need to overdo it. As the Ohm would run out very quickly, Shin Hyun reassured her. Lee asked him if it seemed unfair, and he replied that it did. In dungeons, monsters are not always of the same type. The deputy head of the Dawn Guild said that the young man was right. Shin Hyun thought for a while about the words he heard from his interlocutor. Lee told the young man that 13 years ago, the first dungeons appeared, and they filled the entire world. Since then, more than one type of monster has not been recorded in the dungeon. And at this time, terrible monsters were frolicking above the young people because they felt great in the dungeon. Shin Hyun began to use his power, and the monsters flew away from him at the speed of sound. They were very angry that people came to their dungeon and imposed their own rules there. There was fish food in a large bucket, and some man was scooping it into a plate. He feeds the colorful fish that are in the pond. They trust the man and swim up to him. The action takes place near the villa of Park Tae-hoon, the leader of the Twilight Guild, which is in Seoul. A young man in glasses approaches the guild leader and says that there is information about the suspicious location of the deputy head of the Dawn Guild. The subordinate also noted that there was a newcomer in the Dawn Guild who was being heavily supported, and he and Lee went to clear the dungeon. The head of the Twilight Guild continued feeding the fish and asked the guy what happened next. The subordinate said that they managed to find out that the newcomer was Yoon Sol's brother. She is also one of the leaders of the Dawn group. The bespectacled youth said that Shin Hyun had disappeared for 14 years and had reappeared, his appearance coinciding with Seo Kong Jin's resignation. The head of the Twilight Guild asked where he had been for 14 years, and his subordinate noted that intelligence could not find out. The guy with glasses shared what he found out about Seo Kong Jin. He didn't resign, but simply disappeared. And before his disappearance, he went to Yoon Sol to teach her a lesson for killing his son. Guildmaster Twilight thought for a moment and said that Seo Kong Jin was most likely dead. The subordinate agreed with the head's version and said that this news was quite good for them. Now, Twilight Guild leader Park Tae-hoon has come to the conclusion that Shin Hyun is collaborating with Dawn. Meanwhile, the young man continued to fight monsters in the dungeon. During the fight, he actively used all the powers he had, including those from Murim. He was very happy with the work he had done. The young man was happy with the stones that had fallen out of the monsters in huge quantities. Then the guy noted that destroying monsters is the best entertainment for him. Shin Hyun knows that trying out new skills is a lot of fun, and he really enjoyed it. Lee noticed that an entire hour had passed, but Shin was not tired at all and still cleared everything in the dungeon. Shin told the girl that he was finishing his work and wanted to talk to Lee about something. I asked her if she knew that there was a life exchange cube among the cubes. The girl replied that for this skill, you can exchange health points for mana points. Shin Hyun told Lee that in Murim, achievements can be obtained in a certain way. Then the young man asked if he could endlessly draw the amount of mana he needed, and the girl thought about it. The young man was silent for a while. He thought about something for a long time and persistently, but then it dawned on him. Shin Hyun began to think that he had an inexhaustible source of energy. This information made him very happy. The young man said that by reaching the limit in one art, it would be easier to reach the limit of another. Shin Hyun then said that he would destroy the small change that was left in the cave so that the boss could see how clever he was. Lee replied that the boss had a strong character. Then she thought about how she was an idiot when she wanted to use him and kill him. He definitely wouldn't let her down at the Sun Festival. Monsters were actively flying around above the head of the deputy, head of the Jaihe Guild. She saw them and also began to fight them, using her power to help Shin. Then the girl thought that she could achieve the same abilities as Shin Hyun, and for some reason, there were more and more monsters in the sky. They began to fly closer to the clearing. The deputy head of the guild did not stop fighting them. She became curious why there were so many of them. The fight was unequal. Lee stuck one dagger into the mountain to rest a little and fought back with the other. The girl realized that she was very high up, and a piece of rock broke off unexpectedly. She was flying head over heels, fighting huge monsters, because there was a huge risk that they would destroy her. The vice leader of the guild managed to land in the clearing, safe and sound. She looked down and saw a huge number of cubes there, and wondered when Shin would take them. Lee thought about going back to raise the danger level of the dungeon, because it was much higher than it should have been, and the monsters here were flying type, and she had a hard time dealing with them. The young girl wondered what kind of raid would be most effective here. The vice leader of the guild thought about who it's best to take it to help you. While Ji-ha stood quietly and thought, a huge monster began to circle above her. After a while, several more joined him. They all circled above her, opening their huge, scary mouths. The deputy head of the guild realized that she couldn't handle them on her own, but there was nowhere else to go. The monster's scary face was getting closer and closer to her. She was scared by how huge it was, and she also had no idea how monsters of different levels appeared in the dungeon. Lee Ji-ha used all her magical powers to escape from him with all her might. But the monster still continued to pursue the deputy head of the guild. It was ferocious. The girl looked around and realized that there were a lot of monsters. They were everywhere. The deputy head of the guild was no longer fighting them, so much as trying to outwit the monsters. More and more scary monsters flew towards the girl. They all wanted to attack her together. One, the largest dragon monster, flapped his wings and hit Ji-ha with all his might. And the dagger suddenly fell from the hands of the deputy head of the guild. She was unarmed. The girl was in shock. She understood that she could not cope with this demonic force. The vice leader of the guild understood perfectly well that this level of unusual monsters. Ji-ha then came to the conclusion that something was wrong with the dungeon system, and that there was most likely a glitch. The fear left her after she felt Jin Hyun's hand on her shoulder. Finally, a young man came to her aid. Lee Ji-ha had been waiting for this for so long. The guy took the girl in his arms, and they flew down together. The young man said that the entire dungeon was captured. Stronger monsters appeared in it. The vice guild leader was confused as to why he allowed the scary monsters to roam around here. He said he was waiting to deal with the bosses at the end. Now, Shin Hyun told Lee Ji-ha not to worry, but rather to look for a place to stay. The young people walked across the clearing and began to discuss what they wanted to eat for dinner. Lee replied that now was not the right time for dinner. After everything that had happened, there was no time for food. Shin Hyun laughed happily upon hearing these words and began to use his magical powers against the monsters. He told the girl to wait for him off to the side, laughed, and noted that there would be fried chicken for dinner. A huge number of monsters, who were very ruined, flew up to the young man. Shin Hyun clenched his fists and was ready to fight, although he was completely unarmed. The vice guild leader saw Shin fighting monsters and was shocked by his abilities. The guy saw no one around him except monsters, heard nothing, and used magic. From the outside, it looked like simple blows, but each blow was imbued with pure magic. It was incredible. Lee Ji-ha watched the fight and was simply in awe of the young man. Then she saw that a portal had opened, so she started screaming at the top of her lungs for Shin to leave. But the young man seemed to be hanging in the air and had no intention of finishing his business. Lee noted that the monsters were appearing from the portal, which is why there were so many of them, and she wondered how Shin was going to continue to destroy them. The girl wanted to help the young man. She said that it was very dangerous, asked him to run, but Shin did not hear her. So the deputy head of the guild wanted to break through to him. Lee began to fly, but a huge monster with a terrible grin and glowing eyes appeared in her path. And more monsters began to fly out from the huge portal. The vice leader of the guild saw that the main monster was being protected by small ones. She understood that Shin needed to be saved. More and more little monsters flew up to help their boss. Lee thought that she should have warned about all this, but the little monsters continued to move involuntarily. The vice leader of the guild realized that the large monsters command the smaller ones. They protect the bosses with their bodies. Lee thought about how she could approach Shin to help him defeat the big monsters. Because of the huge number of dragons, the girl could not see the young man. But she still managed to fly closer, and she saw that Shin felt calm. From the outside, it felt like he was specifically among the dragon bosses. Lee concentrated on what the young man was thinking. He could contact her through a mental link. The girl realized that she was encountering such anomalies for the first time and considered them very dangerous. Lee stood below and looked at the monsters. She understood that she had to help the young man somehow. An idea struck her. She climbed onto the big monster's back, pressed herself against him as tightly as possible so that the others wouldn't notice her. She was scared, but she needed to hold out a little. If there were no abnormal monsters, it would become much easier. After some time, the deputy head of the guild realized that she was flying head over heels. The monster realized that she was on his back and threw the girl off, and then began to fight with her. The vice guild leader slashed her sword at the huge monster's back with all her might. He screamed in pain, and Lee only asked how he noticed her. An unequal fight began. The deputy head of the guild became very angry and shouted that no monster was her opponent. The girl looked ahead and saw a huge number of red eyes. She certainly didn't expect this turn of events, and Lee was also very tired during the fight. Shin, who was standing calmly in the air and saw what was happening, began to use his magic power. Lee Jihai realized that Shin had summoned the swords without using the source of power. The young man controlled them alone, and Lee was surprised at how much energy was in his body. Shin Hyun fought hard and then decided that it was time to end the fight. He was a little tired, so he decided to stop pretending to be a hunter, and he dealt with all the monsters. Lee noted that without Mr. Shin, no one would have been able to cope with this problem. But this is also possible in other dungeons. The Vice Guild leader wasn't sure if they could handle such portals under the current danger level system. She thought about it, as she wasn't sure if the guild members would be able to destroy such portals. Shin Hyun held the cube in his hands and wondered if he was spending too much time on the Sun Festival he needed to investigate. The catch was that Park Tae-hoon wouldn't let this pass, and would know about the investigation. If he takes any action, Twilight will find out and destroy Dawn. All this will negatively affect the deputy head of the guild, Lee. And Shin did not want this. The girl thought about what would be the best thing to do in such a situation to conduct an investigation. Lee Jihai stared at the cube that Shin Hyun held in front of her for a long time. The young man asked what kind of stone it was, and how it differed from other stones and monsters. The vice leader of the guild replied that this stone was a monster skill stone, and it was very lucky. They were very rare of this size. Lee Jihai also noticed that this monster was not simple. It was huge and very strong. The vice guild leader thought for a moment, and called out to Mr. Cha Shin-hyun. She looked at the young man for a long time, and said that she wanted to talk to him about something very important. A month later, people were actively discussing the participants of the Sun Festival. They were interested in what would happen this time. Shin Hyun was the main character, who had many rumors circulating about him, including the internet discussing that he had become a hunter a month ago. Everyone was curious as to why the Dawn Guild was so actively supporting him. The young man looked at the tall building and thought that he was most likely a corpse. The respectable man yelled at his subordinate because he didn't know Shin Hyun's level or skills and where he had been for 14 years. The ward was very nervous, sweating profusely and saying something under his breath. And thus an emergency meeting of the Twilight Guild leaders was taking place. All the members of the congregation were in shock, as they did not know with whom they would be dealing during the feast. The leader of the Twilight Guild sipped his soda and smiled. Despite everything, he was very calm. He ordered his subordinates to sit down and calm down, since there was no reason to panic yet. The leader noted that the Dawn Guild was very hasty in choosing hunters, and all because they revealed their cards much earlier than Twilight expected. The guild leader believed that it was also necessary to reveal the cards to understand whether Dawn was bluffing or not. The head of Twilight took a sip of soda and said that the sprouts of the competitor's power needed to be destroyed before they sprouted. An employee of the Twilight Guild was in a cafe. He was scared and had been waiting there for a long time. The young man was drinking coffee and was thinking and worrying about something very intensely. It was noticeable to the naked eye. Then he looked at his wristwatch and said that the time had already come and the man had not yet arrived. A visitor entered the cafe. He stood up from his table and waved his hand at the newcomer. Then he thanked his interlocutor for coming to him, because he made the right decision. Shin Hyun suddenly appeared in front of the man with glasses. But how did he end up here? The young man looked intently at his interlocutor and looked around. The guy with glasses was very worried, took out a handkerchief and began to wipe beads of sweat from his face. He didn't know how to talk to Shin Hyun and what he needed to talk about, so he was very nervous. And then the man in glasses extended his sweaty hand to the young man in greeting. Shin Hyun clarified whether the man's name was Suha Kilo and whether he was a representative of the Twilight Guild. The man with glasses said that it was he and that it was a great honor for him to meet Mr. Shin Hyun. Kilo was sweating profusely. He wanted to find out as much information as possible from Hyun. He then took out his briefcase and started rummaging through it. And Shin Hyun thought that there was no need to worry if everyone in Twilight was such a slob. The man in glasses took out a magical instrument, which he called a soundproof barrier. This device can block out external sounds and is ideal for private conversations, Kilo said. This information surprised Shin Hyun, and his interlocutor asked if he understood what they were going to talk about. The man in glasses said that their guild wanted to form an alliance with Shin Pen's guild. He replied that he already had partners, and the Twilight Guild had already gotten acquainted with the participants of the Sun Festival. The man with glasses remarked that he knew that Dawn was putting a lot of effort into developing Mr. Cha Shin Hyun. Kilo said that they knew about Seo Kong Jin's disappearance and the joint dungeon raid with the deputy head of Dawn. The guy with glasses also asked why Shin didn't join the Dawn Guild. And then he added that their guild realized that Shin had created his own guild as a cover. Kilo explained that they could easily guess everything, since Shin had a close relationship with Dawn. The man with glasses then offered Shin Hyun to join them, as their conditions were much better than in Dawn. Shin laughed and noted that Kilo was much braver than he could have thought, and the offer was not bad. The man in glasses took documents out of his briefcase and offered to discuss specific terms. Shin said he came to the meeting to find out why he was invited, and he wasted his time. Kilo was nervous again. He said that their guild was ready to offer an amount twice as much as Dawn. Shin noted that he promised Lee Ji he not to accept their offer, and that he was not interested in money at all. The guy with glasses asked Shin to wait. He was not ready for such a turn of events. Kilo, with tears in his eyes, begged Cha Shin Hyun not to leave. He didn't know what to do in this situation. One of the cafe visitors asked the guy in glasses, "How long will he stand there?" Kilo looked at the visitor and realized that this was the head of his guild. But how did he end up here? He put his arm around his subordinate's shoulders and said that he had told him in detail about the situation that had developed. The chief had an earpiece in his ear and told his subordinate to continue the conversation as long as possible. He installed a microphone on his subordinate's tie since there was no other point in eavesdropping on them. Kilo continued to be nervous. He sweated heavily and told the chief that he was very sorry for his ignorance. Then the leader of the Twilight Guild thought about Shin Hyun. His action was very strange. The leader had no idea what exactly that Cha Shin Hyun wanted from them, why he came to this meeting at all. Lee Ji he was talking on the phone, and she told her interlocutor that Park Tae-hoon was very upset. The girl spoke with Shin Hyun, who told her that the leader of Twilight most likely knew that he was from Murim, but the heavenly harmony did not resonate. The young man noted that when he entered the cafe, he felt someone's energy. Shin was very cautious. He is not the type of person who waits until the last moment. Shin Hyun said that the Twilight Guild leader would not touch Lee Ji-hee and asked how the investigation of the dungeons was going. The girl thanked him for his help and said that there was no more information about similar anomalies. The vice leader of the guild thanked Shin Hyun once again, because he took on the investigation. He replied that all this was not a burden to him, because he was raising his level. Shin Hyun asked if there was anything else she needed from him. Ji-ha replied that she had no more requests for him. The young man asked the deputy head why she had a gloomy tone and whether anything else new had happened. Shin Hyun's sister Yoon-sol approached him and asked if he had finished talking. The sister told her older brother to go quickly and walk with her. She wanted to take him somewhere. He took the mobile phone away from his ear and agreed with her proposal and went with his sister. After some time, the younger sister brought her brother to a huge building. There were different cells. In front of one of them, the young people stopped. Yoon-sol put her hand on the photograph of her mother and father. The cell contained the ashes of their parents. The girl put her hand to it and said that her brother had returned. Shin Hyun looked at all this and stood there in bewilderment, his face no longer showing any emotion. He thought about how coming to this place was a really bad idea and what Yoon Sol was thinking. Shin Hyun knew that from that moment on, he had changed a lot. He had become different. And seeing the ashes of his parents, he felt nothing. The sister stood next to the cell with the ashes of her parents, and the brother turned his back to her and did not want to look at all this. Yoon Sol stood near the cell, looking at her brother, and tears were rolling from her eyes. She did not understand why this was happening. After a while, the girl calmed down and asked if Shin Hyun was okay. She noticed that her brother did not look sad or upset, which shocked her. The young girl could barely contain her emotions, as she could not understand what was happening to her brother. Yoon Sol screamed, "Why is Shin standing there rooted to the spot and silent, not saying anything?" The younger sister couldn't believe that her brother didn't feel anything at all. Was his heart really turned to stone? Shin Hyun knew that he couldn't hide his feelings from her. He said that he was still her brother, but he couldn't show her what he had lost. The words that Yoon Sol heard from her brother hurt her very much. She did not expect such a reaction. And then she clenched her hand into a fist and screamed that her brother looked like the strangest person. She wanted to hear an apology from him. The girl said that she wanted very little from her brother, and he was a complete stranger to her. She remembered Shin Hyun as a child, how he carried her in his arms. They always had fun together. She asked why her brother had changed so much. And even now, next to the ashes of his parents, he looked too normal. Shin Hyun put his hands in his pockets and stared at his sister. And she said that she wanted to see the brother she once knew. The guy noted that it was a long time ago, and he would never be the same again, and he didn't care. The sister said that she doesn't feel like she lives with her own brother. He's like a stranger to her. The elder brother thought for a moment, and said that he should not have come to this place. The sister's heart was breaking with pain. She could not understand why her brother was saying such words. Shin replied that he would like to know this himself, and why it happened to him. A window with Muram's status appeared in front of the young man, and he couldn't understand why this happened again. Then a question appeared in the status window, asking why he still considered himself human. Shin Hyun froze in front of the system message, as if he were made of stone. Was he really not a human anymore? The young man couldn't understand it. He was interested in why there was some nonsense on the screen. A new system message appeared telling Shin to stop resisting. The young man noted that this is a system that speaks only one way. But Shin Hyun remembered that he was a heavenly warrior according to the reports and laughed cheerfully. But a system message warned him that it could take everything away from him again. But it would take time. Shin said that he doesn't know who sends him such messages, why he needs it. But if he needs it, then let them take everything from him. Otherwise, he will find it himself. The young man stood near the building where the ashes of the deceased are kept. He was powerless and took the tie off his neck. Cha Shin Hyun so stood in place. He couldn't move and thought about something for a very long time. Having weighed all the pros and cons, he came to the conclusion that he would not give anything of his to anyone and began to look at his sister. Yoon Sol's eyes filled with tears. She didn't expect such a bad behavior from her older brother. The girl turned around and walked away from the building where the deceased were kept. Her brother did not follow her. She walked along the streets, the wind blowing in her face, and she thought about how her brother didn't follow her. What an idiot he was. A few days later, the day so long awaited by all people arrived, the Festival of the Sun. Today, people will be able to see heroes exploring dungeons and hunting monsters, the announcer said. All the people in Korea were really looking forward to this holiday. They were in anticipation because it happens once a year. The announcer emotionally shouted that this event in Korea would be the biggest and most grandiose. Everything had been ready for the competition for a long time already. The guilds were carefully preparing for the holiday. Fans gathered on the field, as this holiday is not only entertainment, but also strengthening the ties between guilds. Ordinary people could only see duels between hunters during the Festival of the Sun. Shin Hyun stood to the side and thought that this holiday reminded him very much of the Olympic Games. Lee Ji-hee said that there is a big difference between the Sun Festival and the Olympic Games, and it is the hunters who attract the public's attention and interest. And all because the hunter's strength is very similar to the strength that is shown in films, and it looks much more interesting. The Festival of the Sun is not only an occasion to improve relations between guilds, but also helps to improve the image of hunters. The girl spoke for a very long time and realized that Shin Hyun could not hear her at all. She called out to the young man. He stood in front of Lee Ji-hee and seemed to be in himself, hearing nothing and seeing nothing. Before taking the cup of tea, Lee thought of something, and an idea occurred to her. She asked Shin if it was true that he had a fight with his sister, Yun Sol. Then she saw that the brother and sister seemed to be strangers, and there was some strange atmosphere between them. Lee asked what happened between them. Did they do something wrong again? Shin Hyun asked the vice guild leader to find him a house in a quiet and secluded place. Lee asked him why he needed all this. Shin replied that he received a message in the status window from Murim. Shin thought that he didn't know who his opponent would be. He didn't know his goals. Yun Sol picked up her bow and looked at it intently. Shin thought that his only weakness was his sister. Lee Ji-hee asked Shin Hyun if he had received a message from the Heavenly Warrior and what was in it. She then pointed out to the young man that he must remain with his sister, despite what had happened, as it would be unwise to live separately. The young man was silent for a moment. Some interesting thought crept into his head. Then the guy said that Yun Sol doesn't need a brother like him, because he's not worthy of her. Shin looked out the window at the happy people, and noted that he was no longer the same person his sister once knew. He told the vice guild leader that his sister would be much better off if he disappeared again. Lee Ji-hee got really angry and punched Shin right in the chest. He definitely didn't expect such a trick from her. She said that she doesn't like to interfere in other people's affairs. But if her brother said something like that, she would never forgive him, although she doesn't have a brother. Lee Ji-hee then asked if he knew about his sister as the leader of the guild group. Shin was speechless at those words. A man entered the room and began asking if the deputy head of the guild was there. He apologized and said it was a holiday. It was already starting. The man saw the fight between Lee and Shin. The vice guild leader laughed and said that they had to knock on the door before entering and told Shin to stay inside until she arrived. Shin stood to the side, confused, unable to understand what was going on or why he had to be in the room. Shin thought for a moment, wondering if Lee Ji-hee was angry with him. Meanwhile, at the stadium before the start of the fights, the spectators sat down in their seats. They were waiting for the opening ceremony, which was to be conducted by representatives of the Dawn and Twilight guilds. The audience was greeted by the head of the Dawn Guild, Chuk No-chan, the Crusader class, and Deputy Guild Leader Twilight Jang Sun-hyuk, Assassin class. People were asking each other if it was true that Lee Ji-hee and Park Tae-hoon were from the same guild. To the deputy head of the Dawn Guild was approached by a man named Park Tae-hoon, with whom they began their lives as hunters, and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. The young man was very glad to see the deputy head of the Dawn Guild and extended his hand to her. Lee Ji-hee wasn't as happy to see him as he was to see her, and she clenched her teeth in anger and didn't offer her hand. Then she came to her senses a little, smiled, and asked how Park Tae-hoon was doing. She couldn't help but make a sarcastic comment and asked the head of another guild if the guy who was once her deputy was any good. Shin Hyun watched all this and squeezed the sword in his hands very tightly. He was very angry. Then the head of another guild said that he heard that she was secretly leveling up a newbie and asked if she was always keen on helping the weak. Anger towards the leader of the other guild filled Shin Hyun. He squeezed the sword in his hand tighter and tighter. An unknown force took possession of him, and he decided to get rid of the head of the Twilight Guild with his own hands. Terrible events from her life flashed before the eyes of the deputy head of the guild. It was very painful and unpleasant for her to remember what had happened before, but she didn't show it. Although Lee didn't like this conversation, she continued to control herself and smiled sweetly. The deputy head of the Dawn Guild said that she would take everything Park Tae-hoon said as a compliment. Lee's interlocutor pretended to be an innocent lamb and smiled sweetly at the girl, although his eyes were angry. The interlocutors shook hands, and thus the Festival of the Sun began. The first hunter who entered the arena had the warrior skill consecutive attack. The guild members fought very intensely, and their future fate depended on it. Each of them used all their strength, skills, and abilities on the battlefield. Each wanted to win. The hunters were determined to win, each of them fighting for their place in the sun. The fight was fierce. They prepared for it carefully. Blood and sweat flew in all directions. The spectators watched the first fight with great interest. They couldn't believe that the holiday had already arrived. Duel number 5 was over, and the winner was a member of the Twilight Guild named Sanamo. He demonstrated incredible strength with a blunted weapon. Park Tae-hoon was very happy with his subordinates. He was ready for this, so he recommended Sang-mo to continue this rhythm. And Lee, the deputy of the Dawn Guild, thought that with such warriors, they didn't have to worry. The head of the Twilight Guild decided to leave for a while. He was no longer interested in watching all this. He told Lee Jae-hae that he hoped that he would definitely be entertained in the next fight. The deputy head of the Dawn Guild looked at Park Tae-hoon with anger. He went outside to have some peace and quiet for a while, as the fight had tired him out a bit. Park Tae-hoon didn't expect any trick, but then someone called him, and he really wanted to rest. It was Twilight Guild member Sun Hyuk, who was standing near the column, holding a weapon in his hands. The young man twirled the sword in his hands and asked if he could kill Lee Jae-hae. The sword flashed in the hands of the subordinate of the Twilight Guild leader. Park Tae-hoon smiled and told Sun Hyuk that there was no need to rush in the current situation. The chief asked if he knew Cha Yoon-sol, and he promised to say hello to the girl. The organizer of the event said that now the action will take place in the Battle of Archer's Arena. All the experts can be seen, and the fights will take place any minute. Her assistant said that there are a lot of outstanding members, but he is rooting for Cha Yoon-sol. The event organizer told her friend that Yoon-sol had had an accident. The members of the Dawn Guild were wondering if Yoon-sol would participate in the battles, as she could destroy the entire group. The girl heard gossip behind her back and told her colleagues to speak up and not whisper behind her back. The young people felt awkward and uneasy about being heard. The guild members quickly left the room because they didn't know what to answer Yoon-sol. The girl was left alone in the room. She was not pleased with these discussions that were often held behind her back. Yoon-sol closed her eyes, and I thought about the events of the past days. Enough of them happened. After that day, when she and her brother had a very big fight, they no longer spoke. It made her furious. The girl often thought that her brother was to blame, and she was sad. A girl suddenly burst into the room and invited Yoon-sol to go to the waiting room. This visit was unexpected for Yoon-sol. She was very surprised by such an invitation. And then she became happy because she thought that her older brother wanted to see her. The girl entered the waiting room and saw the vice leader of the guild there, who asked about Yoon-sol's well-being. She asked Lee Jae-hae why she was called just before she was about to go out, and the vice guild leader replied that she simply wanted to support promising talent. Lee also said that she wanted to see her older brother Yoon-sol, but she couldn't find him anywhere. Yoon-sol was thinking about something again. The deputy head of the guild looked at the girl with sympathy. Lee then said that she didn't know what exactly happened with her brother and sister, but that the situation was best resolved. Yoon-sol didn't like that the vice leader of the guild was meddling in things that weren't her business. She asked, since when the deputy head of the guild interfered in family matters, Lee asked not to get excited, because she was worried about both of them. Yoon-sol just laughed. She didn't like the amount of attention being paid to her. The girl then told the vice guild leader that she didn't like her, because she was increasingly influencing her brother. Lee said that it was not true, but Yoon-sol emphasized that her brother decided to become a hunter only after meeting the vice leader of the guild, which is why he is moving away from normal life. Yoon-sol whispered that her brother should never have become a hunter under any circumstances. The sister couldn't understand what her brother wanted if he became stronger. She understood that he was striving for something, but Shin kept silent about it. The vice guild leader looked at Yoon-sol questioningly. She couldn't understand what was bothering the girl. The sister's eyes were full of tears. She noted that her brother was not the same as before. He was becoming unfamiliar and moving away from her. And then the loudspeaker announced that the archers' battle was beginning, and that the participants needed to enter the arena. Yoon-sol wiped away her tears and told Lee that she didn't want to appear in front of her like that. The girl apologized and said that she felt that her brother did not want to change so much. Lee Jae-hae replied that she understood him very well, as she had experienced the same suffering at one time. The deputy head of the guild said that the brother returned from hell, where he could die at any second. After what he went through in that world, he can't be the same as before, the girl added. Lee remembered how she was in that world and told Yoon-sol that her brother was trying to be the person of the past, but was hiding from his sister what he didn't want to show. Yoon-sol walked to the arena and thought that it was very strange to hear information about her brother that her boss was saying. The sister thought about Lee Jae-hae's words and realized that her older brother thought of her as unreliable. But compared to the deputy head of the guild, he stands on equal terms with her. Yoon-sol left the room. She had to have a fight, and Lee stayed and thought about something. Then she saw Shin and said that she thought he was missing, but it turns out he was here. Then he asked why his brother was so worried about his sister, since he was planning to distance himself from her. The young man said that he was just passing by the deputy head, but Lee did not believe him and said that Shin looked very much like Park Tae-hoon. This information from Lee's mouth greatly surprised Shin, and the vice leader of the guild asked why he couldn't tell his sister the truth. The young man asked whether it was worth hiding all his intentions from his sister. Lee replied that if you want to say something, you need to say it directly. It makes life much easier that way. Then the deputy guild leader Dawn calmed down a little and told Shin to come with her. She wanted to show her brother a side of her sister that he didn't even know about, as a friend fired a starting pistol. Thus, the Battle of the Archers began in the arena, and the spectators were waiting for it with great anticipation. In a moment, the teams of the Dawn and Twilight guilds will meet in a duel. Well, who will be the winner? The head of the Twilight guild looked at all this and thought about what would happen next. Park Tae-hoon was very pleased with himself and thought that Lee Ji-hae would like his gift. Yoon-sol prepared herself for the competition, and the leader of the Twilight guild was looking forward to an interesting start. The girl had an earphone through which she could hear her group. They also had headphones. Yoon-sol was very serious, focused, and ready to fight. She understood that a lot depended on it. But then the girl remembered her conversation with the deputy head of the guild about how her brother was trying to be his old self for her sake. She remembered her brother's actions and Lee's words about him hiding, so as not to show his true nature. Yoon-sol punched the wall with all her might, sending small pieces of stone flying off. The girl thought that it was impossible to hide everything, and Lee's brother was not telling everything. Yoon-sol suffered from the fact that her brother still considered her a child, and thought that he was the only one who had changed during this time. After some time, the girl realized that there was an enemy 300 meters away from her. The girl had to concentrate, because during the competition it was unwise to use a bow and arrow without reason. Yoon-sol heard in her headphones that they needed to wait for reinforcements, but she reported that everything was under control. The girl took out her bow and took up a fighting stance, as the enemy was not far from her. Yoon-sol braced herself and used her signature sniper skill, aiming shots. The other team member didn't even suspect that he had been spotted, and only saw an arrow flying in his direction. Yoon-sol attacked the enemy without much difficulty, because she had trained for a long time. A message has appeared stating that one Twilight member can no longer continue the fight. And Yoon-sol was pleased with herself, and knew that she had done a great job, which she had worked hard and for a long time to achieve. Thoughts about her brother did not leave the girl, and she thought that he was constantly looking down on her. People were talking about the little girl who lost her entire family in one day. They felt sorry for her. Her older brother was not found, and the little girl heard this information and clenched her hands into fists. Yoon-sol was sure that her brother was not dead, and that he was definitely alive somewhere. She felt it. The girl prayed and believed that her brother would come to her very soon, that he would definitely be found. The TV that was hanging on the wall started to work with some kind of glitches and interference. The heavenly being prophesied that the day that would bring horror was just around the corner, and that humanity must evolve. Yoon-sol couldn't understand what was happening. She thought that the TV was broken. The girl was taken to the Hunter Academy. She was there under government care. Other children constantly bullied Yoon-sol, and one day a carton of milk was poured on her head. The students bullied the girl and often made fun of the poor orphan. Yoon-sol, however, kept herself in check. She did not give in to provocations and did not cry. Her classmates were talking about how they were paying to study at the academy, but for her, everything here was free. The girl couldn't take it anymore and hit the main offender in the face with a tray with all her might. Then she said that her classmates should not be envious, but rather become orphans like her. They insulted and bullied her, but Yoon-sol said that it was better to stop wagging their tongues and go with her. The main offender held his head. It was very painful for him. He did not expect such resistance. After training, Yoon-sol was hired by the large guild Dawn, and this job was a dream for many. A huge dog attacked her and broke her bow, but the girl was not ready to give up. She picked up an arrow from the floor. It was an insignificant test for her, since she had gone through so many tests. Then Yoon-sol quickly dealt with the huge, scary dog with a small arrowhead. The girl had enough strength to finish the job, and both the dog and Yoon-sol were covered in blood. The deputy head of the guild came to the lawn with an assistant and announced that they had come to help. Yoon-sol, who was covered in blood, said that there was no need for this anymore. Lee asked the girl's name and whether she was new to the guild. Yoon-sol introduced herself, and the vice leader of the guild was impressed. She said that the girl would definitely become stronger and promised that she would remember her. Seo Junhyung, who was next to Lee, felt annoyed. He wasn't the only one who envied Yoon-sol, because he wanted to be the leader of the guild group. But Yoon-sol didn't need any titles. She wanted to be stronger. She needed this in order to hold out until her brother returned. The girl did not allow the slightest weakness. She always thought only about the positive. She trained actively in order to push herself to the limit. She understood that a lot depended on it. Yoon-sol always had a medallion hanging around her neck. She never took off the chain with it and took great care of it. The locket contained a photograph of her parents with her older brother, and she opened it from time to time. The girl was sad because her brother did not compliment her or pay attention to her, but was friends with Lee Ji-hee. Yoon-sol thought that from the perspective of her brother, who studied martial arts, it might seem like her sister was lacking something. But that was not the case. The girl was angry and did not want to forgive her brother for treating her like a little child, because she was not that weak. Yoon-sol held a bow in her hands, clenched her other hand into a fist, and became very angry. The girl listened for a minute and realized that it was very quiet around her, but it shouldn't be like that at a competition. She said into the headset that she was going to change her location to a new one. And then, very unexpectedly, arrows began to fly at her from all sides. There were a lot of them. The girl did not expect such a development of events. One arrow flew tangentially and hit her in the hand. There were 4 guys standing nearby. They said that the target had been detected and they needed to stop shooting. The arrow didn't hit the muscles, but only damaged the skin, and the attackers were hanging over Yoon-sol. The girl thought that the arrows for competitions had a blunt tip. So how could it have happened that blood was pouring out of the wound like a stream? Yoon-sol realized that the arrows were real. One of the attackers said that help for the girl would not arrive. There was no need to wait for it. They also said that they blocked the radio waves and made sure that the broadcast cameras did not illuminate the area. Yoon-sol laughed because she never hoped for anyone's help in her conscious life. The girl pulled the arrow out of her hand. The blood gushed out with greater force, and she understood that she had to rely only on herself. Yoon-sol threw the arrow away, laughed, and asked why they were making such a fuss just to catch her alone. And while the villains were thinking about the question, the girl, she took the bow and began loading it with arrows. She was prepared for the attack and told the attackers that today would be their end. One of the villains shouted very loudly that the girl needed to be killed as quickly as possible. A moment later, a huge number of arrows flew towards the defenseless Yoon-sol. The girl turned away from them as best she could, and the attackers only looked in her direction. After a while, Yoon-sol used her archery skill, and her arrow hit the target right on target. The gang leader certainly didn't expect such an event to develop. He thought that everything would be quick and easy. The girl missed one of the attackers because her arm was injured, and the one who remained couldn't understand how Yoon-sol managed to hit 3 people at the same time and was still in an unstable position. He knew perfectly well that the girl's arrows were for competition, but she was able to use destructive power at a short distance. The villain knew that there were 3 classes of archers, each with their own weakness, and there was a huge difference between them. Yoon-sol knew that she wasn't as strong as she wanted to be, but she was able to deal with those who attacked her. The villain took out a bow and aimed to kill Yoon-sol, but she acted as if she didn't see him. The girl very quickly, almost at the very last moment, dodged the arrow that was flying towards her. Then, Yoon-sol used her sniper skill as she needed to deal with the attacker as quickly as possible. An unknown force began to carry the attacker away somewhere into the distance. He had absolutely no idea what was happening. He certainly didn't expect such a development of events. The guy was angry, including at himself, and disappointed. Very soon, almost all the targets were destroyed, and Yoon-sol calmly thought about what to do next. One of the attackers shouted that Yoon-sol was an impudent girl and was using magical powers. A moment later, an arrow that the girl shot from her bow hit his body, and Yoon-sol, who was standing on the roof, looked down. She needed to understand that she had neutralized the enemy. She leaned down, but what he saw shocked her. She did not expect such a development of events. A stranger pointed a loaded arrow at her from below, and the girl immediately loaded her bow. Yunsol looked down at the stranger. She couldn't understand what he was doing here, and he looked at her. Everyone was waiting to see who would shoot first. There was a strong tension in the air. An unknown force seemed to pierce the enemy. The girl watched this from above. The villain tensed up and released an arrow from his bow, which flew at the speed of light. Just a little more, and a sharp arrow will pierce Yunsol's body. Will this really be the end of it? But with the last of her strength, the girl also took aim and fired her bow with lightning speed. She raised her head up to see if the arrow had reached her enemy and was very surprised. Her older brother stood in front of her and told her to use her martial art. Yunsol's opponent screamed very loudly because he couldn't understand what was happening to him. The girl heard her older brother's recommendations and immediately put them into action. She flew up to her opponent and with all her strength, with great hatred, punched him in the face. He fell head over heels on the floor. He couldn't resist the girl. His bow and arrows fell somewhere. Yunsol was very pleased because she was able to deal with the offender on her own. She was about to finish him off, but then she heard someone approaching her from behind. The man told her that there was no need to kill him. He would surrender himself, and they would sort everything out. Yunsol was reported to have done a very good job during the fight and dealt with her opponents on her own. Radio communication was restored, but it was too late for reinforcements to arrive to help the girl. The people who came to reinforce Yunsol said they had no excuse. Dawn won 6 archery survival competitions. All TV channels reported about it. Television reported that the competition was taking place in a blind spot where there were problems with the broadcast. Hunter Cha Yunsol was able to take on 4 members of the Twilight Guild on her own. The Dawn Guild members who had been discussing Yunsol recently were happy about this ending and praised her skills. The girl closed her eyes and thought that she would like to cope with all this without her brother's help. Then she thought for a bit and came to the conclusion that it was thanks to his skills that she had survived after all. There was a medical helicopter in the sky heading to save the girl. Inside the helicopter was the older brother. He was very happy for his sister, proud of her. The deputy head of the Dawn Guild was with him in the salon, and she asked if he had seen how his sister had fought. Shin was silent for a moment, then he coughed. He didn't expect such a question from Li Ji-hee. The young man then replied that his sister had escaped defeat through the power of martial arts, something he had taught her. Then the guy laughed and said that he was just joking and that Li was right because he didn't know a lot about his sister. He remembered what Yunsol was like as a child and couldn't understand when she managed to become so strong. The elder brother thought that his sister was no longer the child he remembered. He knew that this was to be expected from his sister, and Li asked if he had suggested to his sister to use martial arts. It's a good thing Shimp and Li's conversation wasn't broadcast, even though there was a drone flying above them. It would be very bad if the head of the Twilight Guild, Park Tae-hun, found out about their conversation. At this time, he was sitting in a chair, drinking soda, and was very angry. He was ready for a different development of events. He assessed Yunsol's movements and realized that the girl used martial arts.